I'm Zoe Miller, and I've spent the last 10 years helping failing restaurants find their second wind. I've walked into kitchens that smelled like defeat, and walked out weeks later, watching chefs believe in themselves again. I know how to read a room, fix what's broken, and help people see value where others don't, but nothing prepared me for the night I walked into Lumiere, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, for my in-laws' anniversary dinner, and realized there wasn't a seat for me. 10 chairs, 10 place settings, and not one of them had my name. I stood there, heels tight on polished marble, trying to convince myself this had to be a mistake. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, looked up from her wine and smiled, like she was surprised to see me. Like I was a party crasher, and not family. Her voice was all sweetness, as she said they assumed I wouldn't come since Ben was away on business. My husband, her only son, had begged me to go in his place, so someone could represent us. He had no idea she'd turn that into a chance to make me invisible. The shame hit fast and hot. My face burned. My pulse climbed. And every set of eyes at that table felt like a spotlight on how small I must have looked to them. For a second, I almost turned and left. I thought about texting Ben, crying in the car, letting Evelyn have this one. But something stopped me. A memory. A detail she didn't know. The very restaurant she used to shut me out wasn't just a fancy setting she pulled strings to book. It was mine in a way she'd never imagined. And that night, I stopped trying to belong at her table and sat down at my own. I grew up in a small town in Indiana. The kind of place where people measure success by how early you start working and how long you can keep going. My mom passed away when I was 9. And from that moment on, it was just me and my dad. He ran a garage on the edge of town, fixing up trucks during the day and heating up canned chili for dinner at night. He never made much, but he made sure I had what I needed. That meant packed lunches with handwritten notes, secondhand clothes he ironed like they were new, and endless hours teaching me how to stand up straight and look people in the eye. He didn't say much, but I knew he believed in me. I started working young, first sweeping the floor at his shop, then bussing tables at a local diner. By the time I was 17, I had 3 jobs and a savings jar under my bed that rattled with tips and rolled quarters. I didn't mind the hustle. I liked the feeling of earning something no one could take away. College felt like a distant dream, but I chased it anyway. I applied for every scholarship I could find, wrote essays in the back of the coffee shop after shifts, and cried when the acceptance letter came. Hospitality management at Purdue. It didn't come with a safety net, but it came with purpose. I worked mornings at the dining hall and nights at a bar off campus. I learned to plan events between shifts and studied food safety regulations on the bus. I couldn't afford to join clubs or take unpaid internships, but I never missed a class. I wasn't the smartest, but I was stubborn. I was steady. That world of chipped plates and early mornings and people just doing their best taught me how to spot what matters. Respect. Effort. Showing up when no one's watching. It's a world so far from the one I'd step into later with Ben's family. But it's the one that shaped me. It's the reason I never folded. Even when someone like Evelyn tried to make me feel like I didn't belong. I met Ben during junior year. We were assigned to the same group in a business ethics seminar. And I thought he was going to be just another finance bro with expensive shoes and soft hands. But he listened. Not just in class, but to people. He never interrupted. Never made anyone feel small. What caught me off guard was how easily we talked. He didn't flinch when I mentioned juggling shifts or skipping meals to save money. He joked that his mom would pass out if he ever set foot in a dining hall. Then paused, like he was realizing how far apart our worlds really were. Ben came from old money. His family had roots in Connecticut. Country clubs, multi-generational estates. The kind of dinner parties where you don't touch the bread until someone else does. He didn't act like it, though. He drove a beat-up Jeep in college, even though I later found out there was a Mercedes sitting in his parents' garage just waiting for him. We fell into a rhythm. Study sessions turned into late-night walks. Group projects turned into inside jokes. By spring, he was holding my hand like he'd been doing it for years. He made me feel safe. Seen. The first time I met Evelyn, his mother, I was nervous but hopeful. I wore my best blazer and brought a bottle of wine I couldn't quite afford. She greeted me with a smile so polished it made my skin prickle. Her words were sweet, but her eyes scanned me like I was data she was filing away. She asked where I grew up and blinked slowly when I said Indiana. She asked what my father did and raised an eyebrow when I told her he owned a garage. Then she smiled again, too wide this time, and said how wonderful it was that Ben appreciated such grounded women. At first, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was just overly sensitive. Used to being judged. But it kept happening. Evelyn would compliment my shoes, then ask if I found them at a discount outlet. She'd invite me to brunch, then forget to include me on the group text. At a family event, she introduced me as Ben's friend even after we'd been dating for over a year. Ben didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't want to. He thought I was overthinking. That Evelyn was just traditional. I didn't push it. I wanted to believe he was right. I wanted to believe I was just being cautious. Not hurt. But deep down, I knew. She didn't hate me. It was worse than that. She saw me as temporary. Like a phase Ben would grow out of. Like I was something polite, people tolerated until the real match came along. Still, we stayed together. Because when it was just the two of us, none of that mattered. Ben was kind. He believed in me. He'd bring coffee to my job and wait out my shifts just to walk me home. He'd talk about building a life together. Not building on what he already had. It felt real. But even then, something small and sharp was beginning to grow in the space between his world and mine. I didn't know it yet. But love wasn't the only thing I was going to have to prove. I spent more time getting ready that evening than I had for any client meeting. The dress I chose was sleek, black, and understated. Something I'd bought with a bonus from my last project, and saved for moments when I needed to feel untouchable. I styled my hair into a low twist. Minimal but elegant. And added a swipe of lipstick that made me feel like I belonged anywhere. Ben had called from the airport just hours before, apologizing again for the work trip that pulled him away last minute. He told me to go without him. To enjoy the night. To represent both of us. I told him not to worry. That I had it handled. And I meant it at least until the elevator doors opened at Lumiere. The host greeted me by name and offered a warm smile. But I could feel something shift when he walked me toward the dining room. The restaurant buzzed with quiet sophistication. Soft music. Polished glasses. Laughter tucked into linen napkins. And then I saw the table. 10 chairs. 10 guests. 10 glasses filled. And not one of them for me. Under 2A and Fort, Harold noticed me first. He stood, surprised, and motioned like he wanted to say something. But Evelyn beat him to it. Her voice light and sweet. As if nothing was wrong. She tilted her head and smiled as if I'd caught her off guard. She said she thought I wasn't coming once. Ben let her know he had to fly out. She gestured toward 2 strangers beside her and explained how she gave my seat to old friends who had just returned from Europe and simply had to join. She called it a misunderstanding. Said Lumiere was strict about head counts, and she didn't want to cancel the reservation over a maybe. She reached for her glass and told me there was a charming cafe down the street that might be a better fit for tonight anyway. My stomach dropped. Not from hunger, but from that familiar sinking feeling that someone had made a decision for me, behind my back, with a smile on their face. The kind of decision that tells you who's really welcome and who's just tolerated. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place. My throat tightened. But I smiled. I didn't let it show. I told her I understood. I told Harold it was no problem. I told myself I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. But something about the way she clinked her glass after dismissing me, the way everyone else awkwardly looked away, lit a fire under the shame. It didn't burn me this time. It focused me. Because I remembered something she didn't know. Something she never bothered to ask. And that was the moment the night began to change. I walked out of the dining room with my chin high. But once I reached the quiet hallway near the host stand, my steps slowed. My fingers trembled as I pulled out my phone. More out of habit than intent. I wasn't sure if I was going to call Ben, request a ride, or just sit in my car and disappear for a while. The sting wasn't new. There was the time Evelyn sent out family holiday cards and cropped me out of the group photo. The brunch where everyone had place cards except mine, which had been scribbled last minute on the back of a menu. The wedding planning meeting where she referred to me as Ben's guest. Even though I was the bride, I had told myself not to take it personally. That she was just old-fashioned. That maybe if I dressed better, or brought a more impressive bottle of wine, or stayed quiet and agreeable, she'd warm up. But deep down, I knew those were lies, meant to make something unkind, feel polite. I stared at the exit. One push and I'd be free. I could go home, make tea, and cry in the dark. Pretend I never showed up. Pretend I never let it get to me. And yet, I didn't move. Instead, I closed my eyes and pictured something else. 6 months ago, a quiet afternoon. A stressed-out chef standing right where I was now. This very restaurant. Its future hanging by a thread. Calling for help. And I had answered. That memory grounded me. I wasn't just someone who got left out. I was someone who built things. Who solved problems. Who changed stories. This wasn't just Evelyn's table. This was my territory too. She just didn't know it yet. But she was about to. 6 months earlier. I had walked through Lumiere's doors for the first time, with a clipboard in one hand and a sinking feeling in my gut. The chef, Dylan Harper, and had just taken over the space after its previous owner retired and left a legacy of overpriced meals and stiff service. What used to be the most celebrated restaurant in the city had become cold from lease, outdated, and half empty on weekends. Dylan had talent. He'd trained in Lyon and could make a beurre blanc that melted on your tongue. But he was trying too hard to replicate someone else's dream. He didn't need more French techniques. He needed a story, a reason for people to care again. I spent 3 weeks digging into the bones of the place. I watched how the servers moved, how the music flatlined after sunset, but how the menu spoke in perfect grammar, but said nothing about the chef. I met with the staff, tasted every dish, and read through a year's worth of Yelp reviews. It wasn't broken. It was just soulless. We changed the pacing of the courses, simplified the descriptions, rebuilt the wine list to highlight local vineyards instead of imported prestige labels. Most of all, I worked with Dylan to weave his life into the food his grandfather's garden. His first job at a seafood shack. The spices his mother used when money was tight, but dinner still felt full. The shift didn't happen overnight. But it did happen. By the end of the 4th month, the reservation book was packed. Critics returned. People started asking for Dylan by name. One of our dishes even landed on the cover of a culinary magazine under the headline Revival on the 42nd floor. I never mentioned any of this to Evelyn. Not because I was hiding it, but because it wasn't the kind of thing you bring up to someone who's already decided you have nothing to offer. Besides, I don't like leading with what I've done. I'd rather let the results speak for themselves. That night, as I stood at the edge of her table with no chair in sight, I realized just how loud those results could be. I had helped save Lumiere. And she had no idea. Not yet. I walked back to the host stand with steady steps. The kind that only come when you've made a decision to stop shrinking. Michael, the maître d'hôtel, looked up from the reservations list and did a double take when he saw me. Before I could say a word, his face lit up with recognition. He greeted me warmly and asked if I was there to meet with Chef Dylan. I smiled and told him I was actually part of the Preston dinner. But there had been a misunderstanding about the seating. He didn't hesitate. He excused himself and slipped through the kitchen doors with purpose. It took less than a minute. Dylan emerged in his chef whites, wiping his hands on a towel, eyes already scanning the room until he found me. He broke into a grin and pulled me into a quick hug, as if I wasn't wearing heels and a silk dress, as if we were just co-workers catching up in the middle of service. He asked why I didn't tell him I was coming and offered to have something special prepared. I waved it off, nodding toward the Preston table, like it was an afterthought. When he followed my gaze, I could feel the shift in his expression. Then he turned to Michael and asked him to prepare table 12. The chef's table, the one with the panoramic view of the city and the open kitchen, the one reserved for visiting chefs and food critics and celebrities passing through. I tried to protest, but he cut me off gently and said nothing less than the best for the woman who helped save his restaurant. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. I didn't look back, but I didn't have to. I knew they were watching. As Michael led me across the floor, servers swept in like choreography, setting the table, lighting the candle, placing a fresh floral arrangement without missing a beat. I took my seat without rushing, without flinching, and let the silence behind me bloom. From the corner of my eye, I saw Evelyn freeze, glass halfway to her lips. Harold was already leaning in to whisper something to her. Rachel stared openly, her expression somewhere between awe and guilt. And for once, no one said a word to fill the space. I unfolded my napkin and placed it on my lap, feeling every inch of the chair beneath me. It wasn't just a seat at a table. It was a place I had earned, not through marriage or invitations or good manners, but through work, through value, through something Evelyn couldn't deny, even if she never acknowledged it. Dylan returned briefly to say he had a tasting menu planned and that he'd send over the first course as soon as the amuse-bouche was ready. As he turned back toward the kitchen, he winked, and I knew he understood what was happening without needing the full story. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about showing off. It was about presence. Proof. A woman sitting exactly where she was meant to be, while the world watched and finally saw her for who she really was. Evelyn stormed toward my table, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hum of the restaurant. She accused me of orchestrating the whole scene, of using Ben's name and the chef's favor to embarrass her in front of their friends. Her words dripped with disbelief and resentment, but I stayed calm. Steady in the chair she tried to push me out of. I met her gaze without flinching and reminded her that the invitation came weeks ago from her husband Harold, and that Ben insisted I come even after his emergency trip. I told her I had no idea she had removed me from the reservation, that my role in the restaurant was mine alone and never intended for this kind of spotlight. I shared my credentials quietly but firmly, my degree, my consulting work, the months spent turning that restaurant around. Harold stepped forward, his face stern and serious, cutting through the tension like a blade. He publicly acknowledged my contributions and called out Evelyn's repeated attempts to exclude me. The room grew still, the family members exchanging glances that spoke louder than any words. Rachel looked away, no longer able to hide her discomfort with her mother's behavior. The guests whispered, eyes flicking between Evelyn and me. Evelyn's perfect composure cracked, her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, her smile didn't reach her eyes. I stood slowly, letting my presence fill the space between us. I told her my background was in business strategy and operational efficiency. I held a master's degree from Cornell and had saved dozens of struggling restaurants across the country. She never asked about any of this because she decided who I was the moment she learned my father was a mechanic. I took a step closer and said that I wasn't asking for her approval, but I deserved respect. That night was not just about an anniversary dinner. It was about years of subtle put-downs and deliberate exclusions. Harold nodded behind me, his eyes steady with support. Evelyn tried to deny it, but Harold interrupted with quiet authority, saying her treatment of me had been unacceptable. The room remained silent except for his voice as he said it was time for honesty. Evelyn looked around, searching for allies. but the family had shifted. William, Evelyn's brother-in-law, suggested an apology was in order, and all eyes turned toward her. Her face flushed, a mixture of shame and defiance. She muttered something that sounded like an apology. Though it felt rehearsed and incomplete, I accepted it with grace, knowing it was the closest she had ever come to admitting fault. The tension lingered but softened as Chef Dylan approached and invited Evelyn and her guests to enjoy coffee and digestives in the private lounge. Offering them a dignified exit, Harold lingered, offering me a quiet apology for letting it go on so long and promising it would end. I shook my head and said I was going to finish my dessert and then head home. The night had changed everything, and I felt a quiet strength settle deep inside me. After the storm of the dinner had passed, Rachel pulled me aside in the quiet of the garden. She told me something I hadn't known before, something she said Evelyn never wanted anyone to see. That beneath the polished veneer and flawless manners, her mother came from a world that looked a lot like mine. Evelyn grew up in a small town where her father worked as a janitor and her mother waited tables to make ends meet. She was the first in her family to attend college, clawing her way through with scholarships and part-time jobs. She changed her name, her accent, even the way she walked, determined to leave that past behind. Rachel said her mother worked harder than anyone else she knew to become who she was, to earn every bit of that high society life. But that hard work came with a price. The part of herself she had to erase, the people she pushed away, and the fear that someone like me would remind her of where she came from. I felt a quiet surprise settle over me, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Suddenly, Evelyn's coldness wasn't just about class or status. It was about a deeper fear, a vulnerability hidden beneath years of control. For the first time, I understood her resistance not as cruelty but as protection. This didn't excuse her actions, but it gave me a new lens to see her through. It made me realize how much we both carried invisible wounds from our pasts, and how, maybe, we were both just trying to find a way to belong in worlds that never quite felt like home. Over the following weeks, Evelyn began reaching out in ways that felt almost hesitant. She asked for my opinion on restaurants she was considering for a luncheon with friends, and once sent me an article about a successful restaurant turnaround that reminded her of the work I'd done. It wasn't much, but it was enough to signal a crack in the wall between us. One afternoon, she surprised me by asking if I would share the recipe for a chicken marinade she'd tasted at a family gathering. She said she used to love cooking years ago, before the demands of maintaining appearances took over. When I agreed, she suggested maybe I could show her sometime, as if offering a piece of her true self back to the world. Our conversations remained cautious and sometimes awkward, but they carried a new warmth. The cold formalities slipped away, replaced by moments where we spoke openly about family pressures, expectations, and the weight of history. It was far from perfect, but it was progress. I sensed she was trying, even if it was slow and uncertain, and in those small acts of reaching out, I found a grace I hadn't expected. Two women, shaped by different paths, but bound by the same need, to heal and be seen, standing at a crossroads where resentment could turn to understanding. It wasn't an end to our story, but a hopeful beginning. A reminder that sometimes the hardest walls to break are the ones built within ourselves. And the first step is simply opening the door. Ben and I sat on the back porch one cool evening, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the garden we had started to call ours. We talked about what it might mean to bring a child into this world. Not just a life, but a legacy. I told him I wanted our kids to grow up knowing their worth wasn't tied to money, connections, or appearances. He nodded and said he wanted to raise children who felt free to make their own choices, to follow their own dreams, even if those dreams led them far from the paths we expected. We both agreed on respect, not the kind that comes with conditions, but the kind that's unconditional, the kind that lets someone be fully themselves. I thought about Evelyn and my father, and the invisible rules they had learned and passed down. It wasn't lost on me that we were standing at a crossroads. trying to break cycles that had shaped so many generations before us. I wanted to be a mother who listened, who held space for failure and growth, who never made a child feel like an outsider in their own family. Ben promised to be the kind of father who champions, who understands the power of presence over control. There was a quiet hope in that conversation, a sense of building something new from the lessons of the past. We weren't just imagining a family, we were imagining a different kind of home. One where love didn't have to prove itself with silence or exclusion, but thrived in openness and acceptance. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, I felt the weight of the night's journey settle into something lighter. We were not defined by the battles fought in living rooms or restaurants. We were defined by the choices we make from here on out. And in that moment, the future felt full of possibility. If you've ever felt left out, unseen, or pushed to the edges of a group you wanted to belong to, know you're not alone. We all carry stories of exclusion in one form or another. Moments when someone else's judgment tried to define our value. But the truth is, no one else gets to decide what you're worth. I invite you to think about the times you stood your ground. The moments when you refused to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. How did those moments change your relationships? In your sense of self, I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because sharing them helps us all feel a little less alone. Remember, your place at the table isn't something that can be taken away by anyone else. It's built by your courage, your voice, and your willingness to be seen exactly as you are. Thank you for listening to my story, and for being part of this community where we stand strong together.